Hello, and welcome to the Olive Branch on this beautiful December day. If you're new to the Olive Branch, please check out our website. We have various series that we hope will be of encouragement to you. Today, above anything else, we need peace. We need peace in our world. We need peace in our lives. Peace that only comes from a loving Father. The message today is dramatic. Ken is going to speak about the chaos of leaders that are completely anything but peaceful. And then he'll talk about what real peace from God looks like. So let's worship the Prince of Peace now.
Oh, you've come to bring peace, to be love, to be nearer to us. Oh, you've come to be life, to be light, to shine brighter in us. Oh, Emmanuel, God with us, our deliverer. You are Savior. In your presence we find our strength over everything, our redemption. God with us, you are God with us. Oh, you've come to be hope to this world for your honor and name. Oh, you've come to take sin, to bear shame, and to conquer the grave. Oh, Emmanuel, oh God with us, our deliverer. You are Savior. In your presence we find our strength over everything, our redemption. God with us, you are God with us. Oh, you are here, you are holy. We are standing in your glory. You are here, you are holy. We are standing in your glory. You are here, you are holy. We are standing in your glory. You are here, you are holy. We are standing in your glory, Lord. Our deliverer, you are Savior. In your presence we find our strength over everything, our redemption. God with us, our deliverer. You are Savior. In your presence we find our strength over everything, our redemption. God with us, you are God with us. Oh, you're God with us. You are God with us.
So we're going to talk tonight about, or this morning, depending on when you're listening, we're going to be talking about politics. But don't worry, I'm not going to mess it up for you, okay? We've just been through the mother of all elections in the past few weeks and so on. And as scary and chaotic and controversial and divided as it was, at least there was an election. People had a chance to basically say their piece and vote for whoever they were going to vote for and so on. And I'm allowed to say all this, you see, because I'm an American and I watched the whole thing from afar. Because there are some countries where there's no election. You know, whoever's in power, whoever gets in power, they're there because they murdered somebody, or they're there because they took over power with an army, or something else happened, or they inherited the role. So at least there was an election. Now, the reason I want to talk about this tonight, we talked last week about how God sometimes allows chaos in families or in other places to bring peace. He works through chaos. He can work through anything. Whatever raw materials you hand God, He can make something out of it. He made us out of dirt. So He sometimes allows chaos to bring peace, and sometimes works through that. Now, tonight I want to talk about how He sometimes can work, even though they're crazy and evil leaders in the world. And that's how He sent His Son into the world. And the core idea for tonight, and just about everything I say, is going to be leadership matters. Leadership matters. And sometimes leaders are elected, like I mentioned. Sometimes, they're elected into power, but they lead their nations right into a shredder, just like Hitler did. I mean, everybody elected him to power. They thought he was going to be great, thought he was going to bring control over things and so on. But when he was done, somewhere between 55 and 85 million people were dead. Trillions of dollars had been spent on armies and on all the other military weapons, and then trillions of dollars spent to basically, clean up all the damage that these weapons had done. Leadership always matters, and here's the bottom line. The character of the person that you follow is going to make a huge difference in the outcome of your life and in the outcome of your own leadership. God sent His Son, Jesus, to be born at a time in history when basically the whole thing was dominated by the Roman Empire or by some puppet leader. Herod was one of the puppet leaders of Rome, and of course Caesar Augustus was in power at that particular time. Now these guys were both smart people, they were accomplished, they did lots of things, they built lots of things, and so on. The problem is that one of them, thought he was God, called himself the Son of God, had it printed on all the coins. And the other one, Herod, was like a jack-in-the-box. I mean, you turned the crank and you weren't sure what was going to show up. It could be the evil, crazy King Herod, or it could be somebody who would actually, sell the gold in the palace to give food to people. So it was just a crazy, crazy time of history. Now, these leaders impressed the world. And they were the greatest deal. They were the biggest deal in the world of their day. But God judged them by a different standard than the world of that day did. Leadership matters. And here's the deal. If you want to lead well, you have to know how to follow. If you won't follow anybody, then you really disqualify yourself from leadership. So these are mentioned kind of in footnotes in the Bible. The first one starts out with Caesar Augustus, the leader. And it says, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And everyone went to their own town to register. That's it. He's the biggest deal in the world of that day, and that's all, folk. They mention his name, and then they move on from there. Now, Caesar Augustus, that wasn't his name, actually. His name, he was born as Gaius Octavius in 63 BC, and he was actually the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar actually adopted him as a son and then placed him in power over the Roman Empire. By the time that Jesus came along, Augustus had accomplished a lot. He had been the leader of one of the Roman armies, had defeated a number of different nations and so on. So he was actually, Caesar Augustus, he was actually the emperor from 27 BC to 14 AD. Now, he wasn't crazy, at least not like Caligula was or Nero was. And as far as emperors go, there were probably nobody back there that would have considered him to be an evil person, even though they had the circuses, as they called them, or the Roman games, where they would basically dismember people just about every week and so on, kill them. He had had thousands and thousands of people crucified, but back then that was just part of the deal. So he was, as far as they were concerned, he was an okay guy. He had vastly expanded the system of roads in the Roman Empire. And so what happened is that he had basically established what they call Pax Romana, which basically meant that they had not just conquered the world, but they had made it possible for people to travel in the world, and they had also had this peace that was enforced. Now, what that basically meant was, you mess up or you screw up, you create some kind of a conflict, we're going to come and we're going to kill you. But to think of Caesar Augustus as a wonderful, grand, wise, wonderful leader would be dead wrong. Whatever you know about the history about Augustus and the progress that he brought, you have to realize he was a brutal guy, just like all the leaders were back then. For example, Sepphoris, which was a city that was just probably about 6 miles away from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, they rebelled against the Roman Empire, so the Roman army came in under the leadership of Caesar Augustus, and they basically took 30,000, the whole city, 30,000 of the people as slaves, and then they crucified 2,000 people outside the gates. So Jesus, if he was old enough at that particular juncture of history, could have actually seen this. It was only 5 miles away. So that was him. In fact, Augustus bragged that at one point he had had 30,000 slaves crucified at one time. The only free people back in the Roman Empire were the Roman citizens. And Augustus didn't just, suggest that he might be the Son of God. What happened was that he had declared Julius Caesar God. He saw a star and said that, Julius Caesar had ascended to heaven. And so if Julius Caesar was God, then that meant that he was, the Son of God. And he had that printed on all the coins. So back in that day, these are the titles that he had for himself. And so I'm going to see if I can bring them up for you. There was Divi Filius, which meant that he was the Son of God. That was printed on all the coins. The Pax Romana basically meant that he considered himself to be the giver of all peace, the Prince of Peace. Kaiser Kyrios was something that they made every person say when they would conquer a town. If the people didn't say, Caesar is Lord, which is what that meant, they would execute them all. He was basically seen as the Roman Messiah. He saw himself as the one who was to come. All the names that we affiliate with Jesus, he had basically assigned to himself. In the Roman Empire, the women were treated like property. The slaves were treated like machines, and if you didn't like your slave, you could do whatever you wanted with them. Unwanted children, which would be mainly female children, or children that had any defect. It was just like it was in Nazi Germany. You just got rid of them. They called it exposing them, which meant that they would just take them out to the city dump, and they would put them on the edge of the dump, and the kids would die there. And just like Hitler, anyone who didn't belong to his race or his class was basically seen as inferior and disposable. The only difference was instead of saying, Heil Hitler, people said, Hail Caesar. So someone had to pay the bills for all the things that he was doing, all the construction projects, all the peace, that he had to keep with all of his armies and so on. So that's actually what brought Joseph and Mary back to Bethlehem. They had to go back there to pay their taxes so that they could be listed in the roll. And then, of course, there's Herod. Now, Herod was a totally different guy. He had basically kicked the Parthians out of Jerusalem. And so what happened was Caesar Augustus made him the king of the Jews. Let me tell you a little bit about history. The only reason they call him Herod the Great is because he built great stuff. And honestly, if you go to Jerusalem, if you've ever been there, what they call the Holy Land and so on, you will see all kinds of stuff that he built. There's Masada, which is basically built on a plateau, and it was a whole fortress that he had built. And I'm telling you, I've been there, and it's absolutely amazing. And then he built this port city out on the Mediterranean to basically impress Caesar, for whom he was indebted for everything that he had. And there, for the first time, he built a 40-acre harbor out there out of cement that actually hardened underwater. That was the first time it had ever been used. It's just astounding when you see everything he built. And then, of course, he built the temple there in Jerusalem to impress the people, the Jewish people who really didn't like him because he was only half Jewish. But if you look at the temple, people would, you remember the disciples saying to Jesus one time they were there, and he said, "Look at these stones." Well, there was something to talk about. One of the main building stones in the foundation of this temple was actually 40 feet long, 10 feet thick, and 12 feet high. Matt, they don't even know how he got it there. So just amazing, amazing stuff. But the problem is that building great stuff didn't make him a great person. Hitler built great stuff too. I mean, he came up with the idea of the rocket. He came up with the idea of jet planes. I mean, he built great innovative stuff, but nobody in their right mind would call him Hitler the Great. And it's the same for Herod. You see a little bit about his character in the actual account that's found. This is found in the book of Matthew chapter 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where's the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him." Now you have to remember, for King Herod, him being king of the Jews, that was the biggest deal in his life. It was the most important thing that he had. So you can just imagine what it goes on to say here. King Herod was deeply disturbed. That would be a euphemism. He was ticked. And everybody was scared because they knew that when anybody ever threatened his kingship, people started to die. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law, and he asked, "Where's the Messiah supposed to be born?" Of course, these guys knew the answer. They had the Bible memorized. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophets wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." And then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. And then he told them, and this is just dripping with just ooh, I mean, he just slicked this up, okay? "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." And of course, we all know from what he did that he wanted to murder him and actually went back to Bethlehem when he lost the time. He didn't know exactly where the baby was because they deceived him, and he killed all the babies there. Now, I'm going to talk about this more next week. Herod's biggest deal was the fact that he was king of the Jews. And that's what he wanted more than anything else. And if you looked at the three driving forces behind his life, the first one was that he was trying to impress Caesar, and that's what he was doing by building the port there at Caesarea. He was trying to impress the Jewish people into liking him, and nobody liked him. Everybody hated him, okay? And then he was trying to hold on to his power and title. And he would do anything. He would stop at nothing to do this. To say that Herod was paranoid, I mean, you look up the word in the dictionary and it has this picture there. It's an understatement. Like Hitler, he had a whole Gestapo out there to pick up any clues that anybody was saying anything about him, and if they picked them up, he would immediately have them executed. He was just an incredibly wicked person. And his own family wasn't excluded from that. He killed two of his wives, he killed his brother-in-law, who was the high priest at the time, and he killed three of his sons. Caesar Augustus kind of smirked about this. He said it's actually safer to be Herod's pig, because Herod wouldn't eat pork, he was a Jew. It was actually safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. In fact, right before he died, he gathered up all the leading people of Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. He had them in prison, and he ordered that they be executed the moment he died. You know what his reasoning was? I want at least some tears to be shed the day I die. Incredibly wicked and evil person. And that's what we see so clearly in this story. We see his deceptiveness, and we see, of course, just this murderous heart that would stop at absolutely nothing to hold on to his title and to hold on to his power. By the way, have you ever met somebody like that who will stop at nothing to hold on to their power? Now, there's another group of leaders here that I want to talk about, and it's the religious professionals, and it's a little bit dicey here because I am one. But the chief priests and the teachers of the laws were the ones that Herod called together, because he knew that if he had a Bible question, they would immediately know the answer to it, and they did. Most of these guys had not just the Bible memorized, they also had, all the commentaries about the Bible memorized. So he brings them together, and of course they knew the answer just like that. I mean, where's Jesus supposed to be born? And they knew it. Micah, the baby's going to be born in Bethlehem because of, a ruler's going to come out of Bethlehem that's going to be greater than all the other cities. Now, they were called teachers of the law because that's what they did. They taught the law to the people and so on. But they were religious professionals. This was an inherited job, as were the high priests. You had to be related to the Levites, or you had to be related to Aaron to have this responsibility. Now, here's what's odd, okay? these guys focused like a lot of their attention on the coming of the Messiah because that was the big deal among Jewish people. It's like, come on, give us some relief. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting. We haven't heard from you. We don't know what's going to happen. Send the leader that you're supposed to send. So they were waiting for him. Doesn't it seem strange to you that the Messiah is born 5 miles away, okay? They know the answer to the question that Herod asks about this. They know that the Magi have come and said, we've seen his star in the east, this king's been born, we're going to go and worship him. And yet not a single one of them, according to anything that we've seen, even traveled 5 miles to go and see if anything was true about it. Now, I don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe they were protecting their jobs. I don't know. Maybe they thought, these pagan guys, they don't know anything about what's going on, But here's the point. What you find out, and I say this with some shame, religious leaders can be evil. They can be evil. These were the same religious leaders that when God actually showed up in their town, they hated him and they had him nailed to a cross. Now, some of you are leaders. I know that. Remember what I said at the beginning? Leadership matters. Leadership matters. And if you are going to lead well, you have to learn how to follow well. And this is the question. Who are you following? That's the big question. It's possible as a leader, to develop a tinge of arrogance. And some people have way more than a tinge of arrogance. Because you see, when people like, Caesar Augustus and when people like Herod have people around them, and they're telling them all the time, how wonderful they are, and how wise they are, and how important they are in the world. People begin to believe their own press. They begin to think that it's actually true instead of somebody trying to save their life or somebody trying to get a little bit of money or a little bit of power if it drops off the table. And people are not likely to confront somebody in power like this. I mean, can you imagine, one of, Caesar Augustus's, people coming up to him and say, Caesar, you're kind of getting a big head about that. I mean, this whole thing that you're God and stuff, the Son of God, like that's a little out there. Don't you think you ought to stop it? Nobody would do that. And there's a reason why. It's because life is a good thing. Everybody likes to live. Nobody likes to die. And so people ask themselves the question, okay, so am I going to say something to him about this? Or am I just going to kind of let it go, smile and nod, and just hope that a better day comes? Now, there is an exception to this. And the exception to this are the prophets that come from the Bible. Remember when David, sinned with Bathsheba, so he has this prophet Nathan that comes right up to him, he says, you're the man, and God is not happy with you, and you're going to get punished for what you've done. So he could have immediately had the guy executed, okay? But these guys, especially David, tended to listen to him because what they were saying is, you are not just your own thing out there. You can't just go and do whatever you feel like doing. You are accountable. You're accountable to God. Now, so if the nation of Israel was basically responsive to a prophet, you could call the pagan nations non-prophet organizations because they didn't have a prophet. Nobody, usually went up and told these guys that they were wrong. But sometimes God used, his nation's prophets, the Jewish prophets, to speak to them. And this is where Daniel comes into the picture. I don't know if you know much about his history, but he was a young man when Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem, and I'm guessing that his whole family was killed, and he was hauled off and hauled in to serve Nebuchadnezzar. And over time, he became the king's most trusted advisor. And I'll tell you how this happened. One night, Nebuchadnezzar had this really wild dream, okay? And the problem was, the strange thing was that he couldn't remember what he had dreamed, and he couldn't forget it. He was that troubled by it. And so he told all of his advisors, now, unless you can come in and tell me what I dreamed and then interpret it for me, you're all going to die. Daniel saved the day. He came in and he said, I can't do this myself, but the God I serve knows what you dreamed, and he knows the interpretation to the dream. And of course, the vision was from God. What the vision was basically about was he saw this huge statue, it had a gold head and had a silver torso and so on, and then iron legs and so on. And it was talking about the next 4 kingdoms that were going to come before the Messiah showed up. So there was Babylon, and then there was Persia, Medes and Persian, and then there was Greece that would show up, with Alexander the Great and all that, and then there was Rome. Rome would be the one. And he talked about Rome as being this ferocious beast. He's most troubled by this one. And that's what kind of gives me the clue phone that, Caesar Augustus wasn't this really cool guy. So in this dream, what happens is this little rock is carved out of a mountain, and it comes at this statue, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger the closer it gets. It slams into this statue, and all of a sudden the whole thing crumbles. All the dust blows away, and then this rock becomes huge and becomes a mountain that fills the earth. And that was the prophecy about the Messiah that was going to come when Rome was in power. And I'll tell you, Daniel has this thing right down to the year. I mean, it just bang, 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 bang. You can follow this, and it follows the history so close that people for years thought that it was all made up after all this had happened. Very accurate prophecy. So when Daniel interpreted this dream, Nebuchadnezzar, very enthusiastic. Everybody needs to worship this God. Everybody needs to worship the God of Daniel. Well, you know how people do this, after a while, he cooled off. In fact, he erected this big, huge statue out in the desert, and everybody was supposed to come and worship it. And of course, it was a statue of him, because he was, after all, this great king. He was the gold head on this thing. And so, remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they wouldn't bow down to this thing, and they got thrown in the fiery furnace. He looks in the furnace. They're not even touched by the fire. The guys that throw them in are killed. And he sees someone in there, and it looks like the Son of God. And of course, it turns out likely that it's Jesus that's in there in the fire. Well, he forgets about that too, and he goes on. And then he has this dream. So this is like strike 3, okay? And he dreams about this big tree, and it's just growing and growing and growing, and it's just filling the whole earth. And then this angel shows up in his dream, and he says, "Cut it down!" And they cut the thing down, and they bind the trunk with bronze, and he's just totally baffled by it. He brings Daniel in, and Daniel says, and they were friends, and Daniel says, "I wish this was about somebody else." He said, "But this is about you." He said, "You've gotten arrogant and proud." And he says, "You have a chance. If you will humble your pride, and if you will treat the people that are under you the way they deserve to be treated, because God has placed them under your care," he said, "you might be spared. But if you don't, you're going down." So it's you read the story, and you realize this is hard truth for somebody who's rich and powerful and all this stuff, and created the hanging gardens of Babylon. I mean, he's accomplished a lot. And it's like he's going around town, seeing everything like this, biting his lip, trying not to brag about it and everything. And then it's like he can't hold it back. Because he tells the story himself. He says, "I was out walking on my patio one day, and I just said, 'Isn't this great Babylon? And I've built the whole thing.' Bam, he goes down. He didn't die. But what happened is he went crazy. Like he went out in the fields for 7 years, and he's out there eating grass like an ox and bellowing, thinking that he's a cow. Went crazy, and he lost everything. And it comes back, and he writes this chapter in the Bible himself, and he says this, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud," which would be me. It's happened one more time in Daniel's lifetime, and this time it was with a king named Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar, you probably have heard the story. He's having this big blowout party. And what they would do is they would bring out all the gods, the wooden and metal gods of all the nations that they'd conquered, and they'd line them all up and have a big drunken party about how powerful they were, and they were laughing at the gods, and their God was more powerful. And they didn't have any gods from the Jewish temple, so what they would do is they would bring out the goblets that they had served, used to serve in the temple, and they would bring those out. So they're using these to get drunk with, and they're just porking back the wine and so on, and they're all drunk and they're having a great time. And all of a sudden, this disembodied hand writes in the plaster over Belshazzar's head. And you can just imagine he's sitting there, having a great time, and all of a sudden, pieces of plaster start falling in his wine glass and dribbling down his head. And he turns around and looks and sees this hand. And it says he was so scared that his knees were banging against one another. This hand wrote these words, "Mene, mene, tekel, parson." Nobody knew what they meant. They did know they were in trouble because this hand showed up on the wall, and I can't even imagine what that looked like. Daniel comes in, okay, they finally get Daniel in there, and Daniel says to Belshazzar, he says, Belshazzar, he says, you need to read your own history book because your grandfather got arrogant and proud. And God turned his mind into the mind of an ox, and he's out grazing out in the pastures for 7 years, and he learned his lesson, and he honored God. And then he interpreted the words. Mene means your time is up. Your time is up. It's limited. Tekel means you have been weighed in the balances. Parson means your rule is over. It's handed to somebody else. As Daniel was interpreting those words, the Medes and the Persian, the army had already climbed under the city wall. They had found out a way to dam up the creek that flowed through the city, and they had crawled under the city wall. And Belshazzar never survived the night. He died that night. And God put in a king there, Darius, who was the king of the Medes and the Persians, who would listen to God and who would respect Daniel. Listen to what this guy says. And this is amazing. These are powerful guys, like they ruled the world of that day. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever, and his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. And in this new kingdom that was established, Daniel was given authority. He was, in essence, made prime minister, and he was given authority over a group of people that were the advisors to the kings. They were called magi. They were called wise men. More on that next week. Now, here's my point. First of all, if you're a leader, these words are written over your head. At some point, your time to lead is limited. You're not going to lead forever. Nobody does. The second word is tekel. Everybody gets measured. And we don't get measured by popularity polls here in our country or in our church or wherever we happen to be leaders. We don't get measured by those kinds of measures. We get measured by God. And it's measured in terms of how we treat people and whether or not we follow the ultimate leader who came. And parson basically means that, there comes a time when what we've led is going to get pried out of our dead hands and it's going to get passed on to somebody else. That's the truth about leadership. Leadership matters. So here's the deal with leadership, and as I've watched this over the years, this is what I've, seen. Maybe you've seen something different. See, leadership is a gift from God. Everybody's a leader. And what I mean by this, everybody influences somebody. Everybody influences somebody, and we influence them in bad directions, and we influence them in good directions, or we just basically abduct from the whole thing. So with leadership, we either use it to make a difference, or we disuse it, like we just, pretend like it's not there. We just basically throw it away, or we misuse it to do the things that we want to get what we want, or we abuse it, which means that we hurt people with it. We use it, we disuse it, we misuse it, and sometimes people abuse it. Augustus, you see, was quite certain, of the fact that he was a great leader, because of all he had attained and what he had built and stuff. And look at, I made peace with everybody and I am the one who was to come. After all, I am the Son of God. I am the Son of the Divine and so on. And the problem is, how can you be accountable to God if you think you're God? Which he did. And of course, it turns people into monsters. But then you have to scratch your head and think, if you're actually God, then you don't die. If you're actually God, then somebody else doesn't take your place and somebody else doesn't haul your body off someplace and bury it. If you're really God, that doesn't happen. And it's interesting, Augustus died on August 14, AD. Interesting, huh? That his reign is measured in terms of somebody born that he didn't even pay any attention to. Same with Herod. Herod died, shortly after Jesus was born and so on. And, his life is also dated in terms of Jesus. All through human history, what happens is one human leader after another, they strut across the stage of life, then they limp across the stage of life, then they shuffle across the stage of life, and then somebody carries them across the stage of life when they're dead, and they get buried, and you can find their tombs. There's lots of them. They all die. That's what happens. And sometimes people, they're leaders, and they're quite impressed with themselves. But the one thing that sometimes people never think about, which is strange because it's the most obvious fact of human existence, is that everybody dies. And then what happens, to everything that you've been accumulated? Sometimes people measure their own leadership by what people thought of them and by what they built or by what they conquered. And the actual truth is, and this is the scary truth, is that they're measured by God. We are all measured by God. That's what happens. And here's what we learn from the Bible and from history. No human leader can stop what God wants to do, what he wants to accomplish. That's just true. Now let me dabble in politics, okay? What this means is there is no political party out there, there's no political leader out there where the angels are kind of hanging over heaven saying, ooh, we hope he gets in, he's our favorite candidate. This is the candidate that God likes. Human politics are human politics. We vote because it's the right thing to do. But it's not because, this kingdom that God is building is dependent on the politicians. To actually judge somebody else based on how they vote or who they vote for is just crazy. Because that's not how God measures anything. The kingdom of his Son. God doesn't need a kingdom here because he already has one. And the kingdom of his Son, Jesus, is a kingdom of human hearts. That's where allegiance is pledged to him. That's where that allegiance, goes way, way, way above any human leader, president, prime minister, parliament member, Congress member, no matter who they are. Our allegiance is to Jesus, and it always trumps any other allegiance. And when he brings peace into our hearts from his kingdom is a kingdom of peace, and it's invading earth because that's what he wants. He wants peace everywhere. And that peace then spreads out from us. It spreads out from us sometimes through our family members. If you're a parent, you're a leader. And your influence will somehow change and keep changing people long after you're dead because you will influence your children and they will then influence other people and your influence carries on. That's why you can't look, like 3 feet around yourself and see how your influence is doing. Because influence, what leadership is, continues on after we die. And God is not limited in his options of what to do with leaders. Nebuchadnezzar, crawled around naked on his hands and knees, eating grass and bellowing like an ox until God got his attention. Hitler's charred remains with a bullet in his head, were found in a bunker in Berlin. Mussolini was hung on a hook outside of a gas station upside down. Nixon resigned in shame. Harvey Weinstein was hauled into a courtroom in a wheelchair where he was sentenced. Everybody's accountable. And these were only in human courtrooms. There's a bigger courtroom where our influence and what we've done with it is measured. Even the religious professionals. These guys, they had the Bible memorized. They knew the prophecies. They'd memorized them all. If you're looking for like the old prophetic charts that we used to have, where you can tell what's coming and who's going to be next and what the beast is and all this stuff, these were the guys who had the charts. And yet they didn't even go to see the baby that was 5 miles away from where they lived out their professions. God is determined to bring peace to people's hearts and to people's homes. Whether or not the leaders are good, whether or not they're crazy, Jesus is the Prince of Peace for all time, whether or not Justin Trudeau keeps his job, and he's the king, whether or not, whatever happens to the Donald or whatever happens to the Joe and so on, he's Lord over all the earth. And he is determined that he's going to bring shalom, that he's going to bring peace. And he's going to use us in some way in that whole thing. And here's what comes right into our homes. As I mentioned, you see, leadership is influence. Everybody has influence. Everybody has influence. And it matters how you use it. For some of us, we're a little bit like Herod. Who we are and what we lead and what we have, our kingdom is the biggest deal in our lives. See, God's biggest problem with me is not, Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau or Queen Elizabeth. It's King Ken. It's where I want to run the show, where I want to be king, and I want to make sure that I get mine, and I want to make sure that things flow my way, and that everything happens my way. It's King Ken. And you do it too, right? We all do. We all have this little thing about us that we want to be in charge, and we want to make sure that we get ours, and we want to make sure that, it all flows our way. And when I do that, you see, then I compromise the influence that God has given me. And I'll tell you why. It's because this is what leadership looks like, really. God leaves heaven all the power and authority and glory that you could possibly imagine. Where does he land? Well, he lands in a feeding trough. Humility is the key to true leadership. That's what Jesus taught us. That's what's wrong with all these other people in this story. Leadership matters. And it's not, leadership, like the question is, you have to follow. So, and the question for every leader is, who are you following? Like, whose opinion matters? Where are you getting your answers from? Where are you getting your authority from? Where do you get your peace? That's why this is so important. I mean, if you don't follow Jesus, who's the wonderful counselor and the everlasting Father and the mighty God, and the Prince of Peace, if you won't follow him, why not? Big question. When Jesus showed up 2,000 years ago, he demonstrated right from the start that leadership starts with humility. And the greatest leaders on this planet are characterized by it. Tiny baby born under horrible conditions, laid in a feeding trough, has been his legacy. And he didn't just land there. You think of, he also died on a cross. He left in humility too. The most humbling place, most humbling move that anybody could make. I've said it before, like if you want peace, you have to make it. And Jesus wanted peace. And so he made peace by coming here. The angels who had seen a lot of leaders come and go on the, out there to the shepherds on the hillside, they said this, kind of threw an inaugural party. They said, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He's the Messiah, the Lord, and this will be a sign to you." And you're thinking, okay, what do they got? Kings, thrones, everything like that? And you'll find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. And it was like everybody celebrated. All of a sudden, a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in highest heaven, and on earth, peace, shalom, to those on whom his favor rests." And that's what we get from him. Every morning around 11, I do exercises because I have to keep this amazing body of mine, in shape, and so I know you can all see that. So I sometimes exercise to music, so I turn on the station, So I was listening to 98.1, your Christmas music station, okay? So as I exercise, so turn it on. First song that comes out is by Bryan Adams. We waited all through the year, And then we could be together in harmony. The time will come, peace on earth for everyone. That's what he sang about. And then the next song was the duet by Bing Crosby and David Bowie, Our finest gifts we bring, our rum-pa-pum-pum, And then David Bowie comes in with his part there, Peace on earth, can it be? Every child must be made aware, must be taught to care for his fellow man, give all the... Where does that come from? Well, it comes from Jesus. And they interrupted, all the songs of peace with kind of a jazzy version of Sleigh Ride. And then they got right back to the songs, Band-Aid, Do They Know It's Christmas? Like, what are you just going to enjoy Christmas and let other people starve? All these things that you hear about in these songs, peace and kindness and caring and compassion, they're all related to Jesus. But it's like we live in a world where everybody, sings these Christmas songs and they're all groping around. Oh, I want peace. Where's peace at? Well, how about the one you're singing about? Because it's about Jesus. And he's the only one that can bring it. Truth about me is that I can't bring peace to anybody. But God can bring peace under any circumstances. No matter how evil, no matter how bad, no matter how crazy the leaders are in this world. He's always at work. And then everybody is accountable for the kind of leadership that they give. I am, and so are you, because leadership matters. Let's pray. The gift of influence, God, is a powerful gift. You give us, God, this opportunity on this planet to influence people, to influence their values, to influence the decisions that they make, to influence them, God, for good, and then unfortunately for evil too. Help us, God, to stay on the good side of that equation. Help us to place the words over our head and let the plaster fall into our meal. Many, our time is limited. Tekel, we all give an account. Parson, one day we have to give it all up. Help us to live in the light and the stewardship of what you've given us. Amen. We're going to worship, and then I'm going to come back with a benediction.
You were the Word at the beginning, one with God the Lord Most High. Your hidden glory in creation, now revealed
May God help you to use what he has given you, this incredible gift of influence, to make the difference in this world that you've been called to make, that you've been created to make, that he's asked you to make. And may people be changed. May people find the peace that God has for them because you've lived and because you've shared it with them. Amen.